On the 21st of May 1902, the Treaty of Vereeniging ended the Boer War. Britain had won. 450,000 soldiers had been sent to South Africa to take the gold fields of the Transvaal. 27,000 Boer women and children had died in concentration camps. And 100,000 black South Africans had served the British Army as scouts, as guides, as dispatch runners, as armed fighters, as laborers who built the fortifications and drove the supply wagons that kept the British military machine moving across a hostile continent. They had been promised that a British victory would mean political rights, that the racial policies of the Boer republics would be replaced by something better, that their service would be recognized. The man who wrote the peace treaty made sure it was not. Alfred Milner, the British High Commissioner for South Africa, drew up the terms of the Treaty of Vereeniging. He required the Boers to hand over their arms and accept incorporation into the British Empire. But he made one concession that would shape the next 92 years of South African history. He agreed that the franchise would not be extended to black Africans. The question of whether black people could vote would be left to the white population to decide at some future date. It was not a difficult concession for Milner to make, because he had already written what he believed. In his own private correspondence held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, Milner had stated his position in 1897. A self-governing white community supported by well-treated and justly governed black labor from Cape Town to the Zambezi. That was not a policy suggestion. It was an architectural blueprint. And between 1902 and 1905, Milner built it. He designed the labor registration system that controlled where black workers could go. He created the compound system that controlled where they lived. He appointed the commission that recommended territorial segregation. He oversaw the legislation that created the pass system. He imported 60,000 Chinese indentured laborers to undercut black wages when black miners refused to accept pay cuts. And every single policy he implemented served one financial purpose: delivering cheap labor to the gold mines of the Witwatersrand. The National Party did not invent apartheid in 1948. They inherited it. They named it. They systematized it. But the man who designed its financial architecture was British. He built it 46 years before South Africa gave it a name. And the paper trail that connects his 1902 reconstruction to the 1948 nationalist program runs through every piece of legislation in between. This is the documented story of how Alfred Milner won the Boer War for Britain and then built a racial state to ensure that the gold kept flowing and the people who dug it out of the ground never shared in the wealth it created. The Boer War had been called a white man's war. Both sides agreed at the outset that black Africans would not be armed. Neither side kept that agreement. The British employed over 100,000 black South Africans during the war. Between 15,000 and 30,000 served under arms as scouts and sentries. They guided British columns through terrain the British did not know. They carried dispatches through Boer lines at the risk of execution if they were caught. They defended besieged positions at Mafeking and Ladysmith. The Zulu native police were armed with rifles and mounted on horseback in Natal. The Swazi entered the war voluntarily, with the specific aim of reclaiming land the Boers had confiscated from them before the conflict began. The cost they paid was documented only decades later because, at the time, no one considered it worth recording. 18,000 black Africans died in concentration camps that were separate from the Boer camps. These camps received less food, less medicine, less attention. The death toll was established by later research because the British military administration did not keep accurate records of black casualties. The people who built the fortifications and drove the supply columns were not considered important enough to count. The Boers executed black Africans for helping the British. Lord Kitchener himself wrote to the Secretary of State for War that cold-blooded murders of natives by Boers were frequent. 2 bodies were found in a mine shaft near Greylingsstad with their hands tied behind their backs. These killings are in the military correspondence held at the National Archives in Kew. The Boers also conscripted black Africans by force. Refusal to serve could result in a fine of £5, imprisonment, or 25 lashes. Black laborers conscripted by the Boers received no pay. They were compelled to build fortifications, transport supplies, and maintain siege lines for the same forces that had confiscated their land before the war began. After the war, black soldiers who had served as scouts and armed fighters for the British were denied the campaign medals they were entitled to. White soldiers received theirs. Black soldiers did not. Both sides, British and Boer, denied that armed black men had served with them. Each side accused the other of having done so. It took sustained pressure before any acknowledgement was made, and even then the medals did not come. The men who had risked their lives were erased from the record before the record was even written. These people had been led to believe, through British promises made by officers on the ground, through the explicit logic that a British victory would end the racial discrimination of the Boer republics, that their sacrifice would be rewarded with political rights. Milner made sure it was not. Article 8 of the Treaty of Vereeniging stated that the question of granting a franchise to natives would not be decided until after the introduction of self-government. In practice, this meant the white population would decide when, or whether, black people could ever vote. Milner's own view on the matter was not ambiguous. He said so publicly in 1903. A political equality of white and black is impossible. The white man must rule because he is elevated by many, many steps above the black man. Steps which it will take the latter centuries to climb, and which it is quite possible that the vast bulk of the black population may never be able to climb at all. That quote is in the historical record. It was said by the man who held more administrative power over South Africa than any other individual alive. The man who had just won the war. The man who was now designing the peace. The British had gone to war in 1899 claiming to abhor the racially discriminatory policies of the Boer republics. They had received the active support of thousands of black Africans because of those claims. And when the war was over, the man who wrote the treaty made the racial exclusion of the Boer republics, the racial exclusion of the entire country. If this is the kind of documented financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to this channel. The paper trail in this video has been open for over a century. Milner had won the war. He had written the peace. He had ensured that the 100,000 black South Africans who had served Britain would receive no political rights in return. But denying the vote was only the beginning. What Milner built next was not a political arrangement. It was a financial machine designed from the ground up to ensure that the gold mines of the Witwatersrand would never run short of labor, and that the labor they received would never be in a position to demand a fair wage. In 1902, Milner moved his headquarters from Cape Town to Johannesburg. Not to Pretoria, the political capital of the defeated Boer Republic, to Johannesburg, the city that sat directly on top of the gold. He dismissed Pretoria as the dullest place he had ever seen. The move itself was a statement of priorities. This reconstruction was not about governance. It was about the mines. Milner recruited a group of young Oxford graduates to administer his program. They were called Milner's Kindergarten, a name given to them by their critics, but one they accepted without embarrassment. Peter Perry, the first to be hired, was given responsibility over native territories. His primary function was negotiating with the Portuguese colonial authorities in Mozambique to acquire black African labor for the mines. Lionel Curtis became town clerk of Johannesburg and helped write the city's municipal charter. John Buchan, who would later become famous as the author of The 39 Steps, served as Milner's private secretary. These men were not civil servants in the traditional sense. They were the engineers of a new racial order built around a single economic requirement, the uninterrupted profitability of the gold mines. Milner's first structural instrument was the labor registration system. He imposed an integrated registration framework across the Witwatersrand that transformed the function of every rural administrator in the Transvaal and the Cape. Magistrates, tax collectors, labor registrars. All of them were redirected toward a single purpose, the mobilization of the mine's labor force. Every black worker who entered the Witwatersrand was registered. Every movement was documented. Every contract was recorded and enforced. The system was built at the specific request of the Chamber of Mines, the organization representing the gold mining companies. Keith Breckenridge's academic paper, Lord Milner's Registry, documents this using the Transvaal Native Affairs Department's own annual reports as primary sources. The second instrument was the compound system. Black mine workers were housed in closed compounds on the mine properties. They could not leave without authorization. They could not bring their families. They lived in barracks, rows of concrete bunks and windowless dormitories designed to hold the maximum number of bodies in the minimum amount of space. They ate in communal mess halls. They were searched entering and leaving the compound. They worked underground for the duration of their contracts, typically 6 to 12 months, and were returned to the rural areas when the contract expired. Then the cycle began again. The compound was not accommodation. It was a mechanism of control. It prevented workers from organizing across mines. It prevented them from comparing wages. It prevented them from accessing any economic opportunity outside the mining industry. A man inside a compound could not start a business, could not farm, could not trade, could not build. He could dig gold. And when he was finished digging gold, he could go home until it was time to dig gold again. The human cost was documented in the Transvaal Labor Commission's own reports. In the 6 months from November 1902 to April 1903-86, black miners were killed in accidental deaths alone, an average of 14 per month. The overall death rate among black mine workers in 1903 was 80 per thousand. Black workers were frequently assaulted by white supervisors underground. The Commission's evidence records it in the language of administrative routine, as though men dying at a rate of 80 per thousand were a staffing problem rather than a human catastrophe. In May 1903, 380 black Africans were recruited from British Central Africa, modern Malawi, by the Witwatersrand Native Labour Association on one-year contracts. It was an experiment to test whether the mines could recruit cheap labor from north of the Zambezi. By the end of the contract period, more than a quarter of those men were either dead or permanently disabled, 1 in 4. The survivors were sent home. The recruitment agents moved on to the next territory. The third instrument was wage suppression. When black miners resisted wage cuts after the war, Milner did not negotiate. He authorized the importation of 60,000 Chinese indentured laborers. These workers were brought in under contracts that restricted them to specific tasks on specific mines. They could not move freely. They could not change employers. They could not remain in South Africa permanently. The importation served two purposes simultaneously. It broke the bargaining power of black workers by flooding the labor market, and it established a legal precedent for a statutory color bar in the gold mining industry, a formal division of labor by race that determined who could do what work regardless of skill or experience. The Chinese experiment provoked outrage in Britain and in the Transvaal. It nearly brought down the Conservative government in London. Most of the Chinese laborers were repatriated by 1910. But the precedent had been set. The principle that the state could import foreign labor to suppress local wages and could enforce racial categories in the division of work was now embedded in the legal and economic architecture of South Africa. Every instrument Milner built served the same financial logic. The registration system told the mines where the labor was. The compound system delivered it. The wage suppression mechanism ensured it stayed cheap. The entire apparatus was designed not by ideologues but by administrators whose primary concern was the quarterly output of the Witwatersrand goldfields. If you're watching this video and recognizing the pattern, where the financial requirements of an industry determine the racial architecture of an entire nation, you are seeing exactly what this channel was built to document. Subscribe and I will see you at every paper trail. Milner had built the registration system, the compound system, and the wage suppression mechanism. But these were operational instruments. They controlled where black workers went and what they were paid. What Milner needed next was a legal foundation, a framework that would give racial segregation the permanent force of law, not through ideology, through a commission whose recommendations would be treated as expert policy. And the man he appointed to lead that commission would produce the blueprint for everything that followed, including the act that would take the land itself. In 1903, Milner appointed Sir Godfrey Lagden to chair the South African Native Affairs Commission. Lagden's brief was to develop a common native policy across all 4 colonies that would form the future Union of South Africa. Lagden was not a member of Milner's kindergarten. He had no Oxford degree, no aristocratic connections. He had started his career as a postal clerk in the British Post Office. But he had spent years as a colonial administrator in Basutoland, and he understood the machinery of racial administration better than any man in Milner's government. Keith Breckenridge's research identifies him directly. Lagden was the creature of the gold mining industry. The Chamber of Mines wanted a commission that would produce recommendations serving the mine's need for controlled cheap labor. Lagden delivered exactly that. Between 1903 and 1905, the commission heard testimony from members of the educated black African elite, teachers, clergy, professionals, community leaders, who described the discrimination they faced and argued for political equality. They presented their case in English. They cited British principles of justice. They referenced the promises that had been made during the war. They asked for what they had been told they would receive, a fair hearing and a chance to participate in the governance of their own country. The commissioners listened to every word. They recorded the testimony. Then they concluded the opposite. The Lagden Commission recommended that there should be no political equality between black and white, that separate voters' rolls should be established, that territorial separation of the races was advisable, and that black Africans should be confined to designated native reserves, land that comprised the least productive territory in the country. The recommendations endorsed the ideas of Theophilus Shepstone, which promoted the creation of so-called native reserves for easy administrative rule. In practice, this meant pushing the majority population onto a fraction of the land and freeing the rest for white settlement and mining operations. The General Pass Regulations Bill was enacted in 1905. It denied black South Africans the vote entirely. It confined them to fixed areas. And it created the pass system, the requirement that every black person carried documentation authorizing their presence in any designated area. Failure to produce the pass on demand was a criminal offense. The pass system would endure for 81 years. It would not be abolished until 1986. Between 1916 and 1986, more than 17 million pass law prosecutions were recorded in South Africa. 17 million criminal cases. For the offense of being in the wrong place without the right piece of paper, the system began with Milner's 1905 legislation. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was established as a whites-only political entity. Black South Africans, the majority of the population, had no meaningful representation. The Lagden Commission's recommendations were embedded in the founding constitution of the state. In 1912, 1 year before the legislation that would formalize the land theft, a group of black South African leaders founded the South African Native National Congress. It would later be renamed the African National Congress. One of its co-founders was a man named Solomon Shekisho Plaatje. He was a journalist, a writer, a translator who spoke 6 African languages in addition to English, Dutch, and German. He had translated Shakespeare into Setswana, and he was about to become the most important witness to what happened next. In 1913, the Natives Land Act was passed. Act No. 27 of 1913. It defined less than 10% of South Africa as black reserves. It prohibited black people from purchasing or leasing land outside those reserves. It banned sharecropping, the system through which black farmers had been cultivating white-owned land and sharing the harvest with the landowner. Overnight, the landlord-tenant relationship that had sustained black rural communities became a criminal offense punishable by a fine of £100. 90% of the land was allocated to white settlers who made up a minority of the population. Plaatje got on a bicycle. In the months after the act came into effect, he rode through the Orange Free State collecting testimony from the people who had been evicted. He documented what he found in a book published in 1916, Native Life in South Africa. He wrote that the law makes it illegal for natives to live on farms except as servants in the employ of Europeans. He can only live in town as a servant in the employ of a European. He recorded the story of a young couple with a sick baby who were forced off the land they had been farming. They hitched up their wagon. After 2 nights on the road, their baby died. They had no land on which to bury the child. The only place where they were legally permitted to exist was the public road. They dug a grave under cover of darkness, in fear that the owner of the land might discover them, and buried their child in a stolen grave. Plaatje wrote that the South African native found himself not actually a slave but a pariah in the land of his birth. A great revolutionary change wrought by a single stroke of the pen. The Natives Land Act did not just redistribute land. It manufactured a labor force. It took people who had been self-sufficient, who had grown their own food, raised their own livestock, built their own homes on land their families had farmed for generations, and converted them into workers who had no choice but to sell their labor for whatever the mines and the white farms were willing to pay. The act was the final instrument in Milner's machine. The registration system told the mines where the workers were. The compound system housed them, the pass system controlled their movement, and the Land Act destroyed their ability to survive outside the system entirely. Plaatje traveled to Britain with a delegation from the newly formed African National Congress to protest the act. They appealed to the imperial government. The appeal was rejected. The paper trail of that rejection is in the public record. The people who had fought for Britain were told by Britain that their land was no longer theirs. If this video is changing how you understand the origins of apartheid, share it with someone who still believes it began in 1948. The financial paper trail starts in 1902. Milner left South Africa in 1905. He was raised to the peerage. He never returned. He died in 1925. But the machine he built did not require his presence to operate. It ran on the logic he had embedded in its design, cheap labor for the mines, racial separation to enforce it, and a legal architecture that made resistance a criminal offense. What the National Party did in 1948 was not an invention. It was a renovation of a building whose foundations had been laid 46 years earlier. The documents show how well treated that labor actually was. The National Party came to power in South Africa in 1948 on a platform of apartheid, a word meaning separateness in Afrikaans. The policy was presented as something new. It was not new. Every major instrument of apartheid had a direct precedent in Milner's reconstruction. The pass system, created by Milner's General Pass Regulations Bill of 1905, was expanded under apartheid into the most comprehensive system of movement control in the modern world. Every black South African was required to carry a passbook at all times. Failure to produce it on demand was a criminal offense. The system that Milner had designed to deliver labor to the gold mines became the system that controlled the movement of an entire population across an entire country for the next 4 decades. The territorial segregation, recommended by Milner's Lagden Commission in 1905 and enacted through the Natives Land Act of 1913, was expanded into the Bantustan system. The apartheid government designated 10 so-called homelands for black South Africans. These territories comprised approximately 13% of the country's land. The remaining 87% was reserved for white South Africans who made up less than 20% of the population. Between 1960 and 1983, 3.5 million people were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated into these designated areas. It was one of the largest mass removals in modern history. The compound labor system, built by Milner to house mine workers in closed facilities on the Witwatersrand, became the model for the migrant labor system that powered the apartheid economy. Black workers were classified as temporary sojourners in white areas. They were permitted to work, but not to live permanently. Their families remained in the homelands. The mines continued to operate on the same principle Milner had established in 1902, controlled labor, suppressed wages, racial division of work. The color bar, set as a precedent by Milner's importation of Chinese indentured laborers, was formalized into statute. The Mines and Works Act reserved skilled and semi-skilled mining jobs for white workers. Black miners were confined to unskilled manual labor regardless of their ability or experience. The financial logic was unchanged from Milner's original design: keep the labor cheap, keep the gold profitable, keep the racial hierarchy in place to ensure both. On the 21st of March, 1960, 58 years after Milner signed the Treaty of Vereeniging, 5,000 black South Africans gathered outside a police station in Sharpeville to protest the pass laws. They carried no weapons. They had come to surrender their passbooks in an act of civil disobedience, to refuse to carry the documents that Milner's 1905 legislation had first required. They gathered in the morning. They chanted freedom songs. By the afternoon, the crowd had grown, and the police were watching from behind a wire fence with armored vehicles positioned at the perimeter. Sharpeville is a township of Vereeniging, the same town where Milner had signed the treaty that denied black South Africans the franchise. The same town where the system began. 58 years later, the people who had lived under that system walked to a police station in the same town and said no more. The police opened fire without warning. The shooting lasted approximately 2 minutes. 69 people were killed. At least 180 were wounded. Many of them were shot in the back as they tried to run. The victims included women and children. The official inquest recorded 8 women and 10 children among the dead. Eyewitness accounts confirmed at the subsequent inquiry that no warning to disperse had been given. A photographer named Ian Barry was present. He later said he initially thought the police were firing blank rounds. They were not. They were killed for protesting a law that a British administrator had written 55 years earlier to ensure that the gold mines would never run short of cheap labor. The pass system that Milner created in 1905 killed 69 people at Sharpeville in 1960. The chain is direct. Every link is documented. After Sharpeville, the South African government declared a state of emergency. More than 11,000 people were detained. The African National Congress, the organization that Plaatje had co-founded in 1912, was outlawed. The international community could no longer ignore what was happening. Boycott movements began. South Africa was banned from the Olympics starting in 1964. The divestment campaigns of the 1970s and 80s followed. The economic pressure mounted. The pass laws were finally abolished in 1986, 81 years after Milner's General Pass Regulations Bill had created them. Apartheid itself was formally dismantled in 1994 when South Africa held its first democratic election. Nelson Mandela became president, 92 years after the Treaty of Vereeniging, 92 years after Alfred Milner wrote a peace treaty that guaranteed black South Africans would have no political voice in the country they had helped to win. The system he designed took 92 years to dismantle. He had been dead for 69 of them. The gold mines were still operating. The Witwatersrand was still producing. The labor was no longer compelled by law. But the economic geography that Milner had engineered, the townships, the former homelands, the migrant labor patterns, the concentration of wealth in the mining districts, remained structurally intact. Milner's private correspondence is held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The Lagden Commission records are in the South African archives. The text of the Natives Land Act of 1913 is publicly accessible. Plaatje's Native Life in South Africa was published in 1916 and is available through Project Gutenberg. Keith Breckenridge's Lord Milner's Registry draws on the Transvaal Native Affairs Department's own annual reports. The Sharpeville inquest records are in the South African National Archives. Every claim in this video is drawn from publicly accessible primary sources. The standard account of apartheid begins in 1948 with the National Party election. The documents begin in 1902 with a British High Commissioner who believed that political equality of black and white was impossible. who said so in his own words. Who built a financial machine to make sure it stayed that way? The gold mines needed labor. Milner built a racial state to deliver it. The National Party gave it a name. The people who lived under it gave it 92 years of their lives before they were allowed to vote. Milner's own words from 1897, a self-governing white community supported by well-treated and justly governed black labor, could have been written as the mission statement of the apartheid state. The language would not have needed changing. Only the name. The 21st of March, the date of the Sharpeville massacre, is now a public holiday in South Africa. It is called Human Rights Day. It is also recognized internationally as the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The date was chosen because of what happened at Sharpeville. The pass laws that caused it were written by a British administrator in 1905. The treaty that enabled them was signed in the same town in 1902. The system they created was not dismantled until 1994. Every link in that chain is in the public record. The paper trail runs from the Bodleian Library in Oxford to the National Archives in Pretoria to the graves at Sharpeville. It has been open for over a century. If this video changed how you understand where apartheid came from, share it with someone who still believes it was invented in 1948. It was designed in 1902 by a British man in Johannesburg. For the gold mines. Leave a $sign in the comments if you made it to the end. I will see you in the next one.